Ukraine will not give up land to get peace in the Russia-Ukraine war. I might better have titled this episode, Zelensky Decides Not to Have Peace, because that's the net result of this. In the context of all the things that have been going on, every diplomatic activity that's happened since Trump was inaugurated in January of this year, all the things that have happened, the Anchorage, Alaska, the multiple meetings with Witkoff, the many trips back and forth to Europe, all of this kind of boils down to this moment right here, to where Zelensky is impervious to any of the movements at all from President Trump, is oblivious to what's happening on the battlefield. And I believe history is going to show that this was the last moment, very possibly, that there could have been a diplomatic solution to this. And I think he will now have condemned himself and his country to a military defeat. That's a pretty stark statement, but I think that the evidence supports that. And we're going to get into that today. And we have nobody better to talk about this on this very topic than the amazing Colonel Douglas Macgregor, defense and foreign policy analyst and former advisor to the Secretary of Defense and highly decorated combat veteran. Doug, welcome back to the show.
Hey, thanks. Appreciate it.
Well, listen, kind of an auspicious start there, but given the news that came out, I guess last night, you and I were talking about some other related topics late last night when this first came out. And Gary, if you can toss this that Washington Post headline up, because I think this really says it all. Zelensky rules out ceding land to Russia. That's like, thanks for your contribution to national security, President Trump, but yeah, no. And then according to the article, Ukraine will not surrender territory. President Volodymyr Zelensky declared Monday, rejecting a central Russian demand that President Trump had incorporated into his latest proposal to end the Kremlin's war. Under our laws, Zelensky says, under international law and under moral law, we have no right to give away anything, Zelensky said after meeting with top European leaders to discuss Trump's plan on Monday. That is what we are fighting for. What do you make of that, Doug?
Well, I think it's time to warm up the engines on his private plane for a flight to Israel because he's irrelevant and he has no future. And the sad part is that he flew to meet with the three leaders, Paris, London, and Berlin in 10 Downing Street, I think for the purpose of receiving reassurance that is totally meaningless, that they will stand by him and support his position of no concessions whatsoever to Russia. Those three leaders are in the high teens, low 20s in terms of approval. I can't think of three political figures in the history of Europe who are more widely reviled, hated, and detested inside their own countries than Merz, Macron, and Starmer. So this is sort of like showing up just before the Soviets invade Poland from the east and the Germans invade Poland from the west, and being told in London, oh, we'll stand by you, stick with us, we're on your side, just before Poland vanishes from the map. I think that's essentially where Zelensky is right now. It's an unrealistic position. We shouldn't be surprised. And remember, these are the globalists. They're all in cahoots with each other, so to say. All of them have contributed mightily to the destruction of Europe by not only pushing Russia to war in Ukraine and then subsidizing this disaster in the hopes of harming Russia. They've also opened the floodgates to people from Africa, the Middle East, all over Asia, to pour into their countries at a point in time when they can barely hold their countries together financially and sustain the existing welfare structures that are very, very lucrative and very expensive inside Europe. So to sum up, these are terrible people. They're all going to be gone. The question is, do they last through Christmas? How far do they last into the coming year? I'm not sure they're going to last very long.
Doug, that's an interesting point you bring up here. And I think something that's important. I want to go down that trail a little bit. If you are, you meaning these three leaders, if they are at least intelligent and they can see the truth and they have their own desires and they can say, well, I see that Ukraine's going to lose this war, but we're going to continue going down this path. That's one bad thing. But it might be worse if somehow they have self-deluded that they don't actually believe that, because here's what the evidence suggests there's a real dilemma or problem here is that if they keep going down this path, there's no military possibility they can even avoid defeat. And it's probably coming closer and closer, as you've pointed out here. But then that would mean if all of these problems that they had, especially from the early 2022, when they had these millions of people flooding out of the Ukrainian country into their countries, and now then a lot of the countries are saying, hey, we want to get rid of them. We're running out of money. Germany, for example, is cutting down some of the money that they've been giving these refugees. If what you describe happens, and the Russians just win the war here, there's going to be a new flood into these European countries. Have they not thought of that?
Well, maybe. The flood that you're talking about may or may not occur simply because most of the people that could leave and wanted to leave Ukraine are gone. What we're finding out, and you've had some of these German journalists, I think one was Baba, there's another one, you've actually interviewed them. And what they return from Ukraine with is the understanding that the majority of the population in Ukraine wants an end to the war. And many of them have concluded that we'll never have peace if we remain this potential catalyst for war with Russia. Therefore, we have to find a new way with Russia, whether that's neutrality or even some form of confederation. We just want an end to this. That's more widespread than we are hearing in the West. So I think the idea that there'll be more refugees, certainly there will be some, but not on the scale that we've seen thus far. In fact, the Poles don't say it publicly, but the Polish government wants very much an end to this so they can send 3 million Ukrainians back to Ukraine, and with good reason. Everybody loses sight of the fact you start bringing in foreigners, I don't care who they are, it's going to cost you a lot of money. And nobody can really afford it in the current economic situation that virtually Europe and the United States and much of the world confronts. So that's one thing. I think, on the other hand, there's something else, and that is, and this is going to sound terrible, but I'm increasingly convinced of this. These people have become Hitlerian. Remember, Hitler concludes by April of 1945 that if he can't win, then not only he but everybody deserves to go down with him. In other words, well, we might as well all burn it down until there's nothing left. I mean, Hitler could have handled things very differently at many, many points in time during the Second World War. He refused to do it. And Napoleon was just about as bad, not quite as bad, but in the same category. He refused to take the opportunity to make peace when it was offered to him several times. That doesn't work over the long haul, as we know, and what happened to both of them. So I think that right now, Starmer, Merz, and Macron in particular have decided there's nowhere for us to go. We're finished. If this fails, we all go down with the ship. Zelensky can still fly to Israel. But Starmer, Macron, and Merz are in a different position. They can't just fly to Israel.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned the issue about the immigration and whatnot, because just a little bit of time ago, I guess President Trump himself was talking about that very issue.
Most European nations, they're decaying. They want to be politically correct, and it makes them weak. That's what makes them weak.
It sounds like you want to see some pretty massive changes.
Well, I think they should get the people out that came into the country illegally.
So he's already talking. That was, I said recently, that was actually made yesterday, I think, and produced, just released this morning. So he seems to be focused pretty much on that, which I know is something you focus on a lot too, which you literally just said.
Yeah, of course, keep in mind that this is a case of the pot calling the kettle black. We are in far worse condition in many respects than he attributes to Europe. So I don't disagree with what he's saying, but he's making the same kind of disastrous mistake strategically inside his own country and around the world that they are making in Europe. Well, we'll get to that later, I hope.
Well, we will, and I want to drill down a little bit more on what's going on with Zelensky here, because I want to set the stage for why we're arguing that the end could be coming nearer. So the whole context here is that this period started with Trump, released, or at least it was leaked, that there was a 28-point peace plan, and then apparently it got knocked down to 19. Well, now then there's been a new version apparently that was just a couple of days ago solidified into 20 that still has some issues outstanding, and it was on that negotiation that Zelensky said, it's not going to include the things that Trump wants. It's not going to include the things that Trump has already gotten the Russians that said they would at least contemplate, which is the territory. Well, then in that same interview, I just showed you a piece there a second ago, Trump has also asked, what do you think about Zelensky?
Is it time for Ukraine to hold an election, do you think?
Yeah, I think so. It's been a long time. It's hasn't been doing particularly well. Yeah, I think it's time. I think it's an important time to hold an election. You know, they're using war not to hold an election, but I would think the Ukrainian people would, should have that choice, and maybe Zelensky would win. I don't know who would win, but it gets to a point where it's not a democracy anymore.
That's pretty strong right there. It's getting to the point it's not a democracy anymore. That's Trump saying out loud on the heels of Zelensky saying, thanks for your input, but we're not going to go down your path here. Is Trump setting the stage for it's time for us to walk away?
A couple of points. First of all, I understand there's a 15-point version of the same plan that currently hangs in the men's room of the Kremlin. And people visiting the men's room are being invited to add any additional points that they think are useful. So that's where I would put the 15, 28, 20, whatever the point plan that we've set forth probably belongs. He had this, or not President Trump, but President Putin was kind enough to meet with Vitkov and Kushner. And of course, after that 5-hour meeting, nothing really emerged. And I don't think anything is going to emerge. The Russians are in the driver's seat. They have militarily won this war. They're cleaning up the battlefield, frankly, at this point. You still have a few hundred Ukrainian troops down in Pokrovsk. There are other pockets of Ukrainians in various places. And they've been offered the opportunity to surrender. And I think they should. Maybe they will, but if they don't, they'll be annihilated. And then the Russians will consolidate what they've got, and then they will move forward. I think Odessa is very much on the agenda right now because Odessa is this open wound. We and others continue to funnel not just equipment, military equipment and ammunition and so forth into Odessa. I'm told we're also clandestinely pushing mercenaries into Odessa. And in fact, there are a lot of mercenary troops that are being captured right now on the battlefield in Ukraine. They're not finding very many Ukrainians anymore that want to fight, because to fight means almost certain death. So your best shot at this point is to take the money that you get out of the Three Stooges that met with Zelensky or from Washington and put it against mercenaries. And that's something the CIA, MI6, Mossad are very good at doing, and that's probably who's honchoing that operation. It's over. The end is here. So I think that's the first part. Second part is, first of all, I really tire of this word democracy, because we're not a democracy. We're a republic. We have democratic features and attributes, but we are preeminently a republic. So, by the way, is Ukraine. Our friend Zelensky has been the de facto Stalinist-style dictator of Ukraine now for a long time. And his argument, which is not unreasonable, by the way, is if he's going to pursue the open-ended extreme policies that he has to be a dictator. So it's interesting that President Trump now says this. So what we ought to do, and you guys have a great staff, you know how to do this, is go back and listen to what President Trump says over the last several years. And I remember him appearing in front of a rally back in, I guess this would have been 24, talking to one of the MAGA rallies and saying, how about that guy Zelensky? He's a really tough, courageous guy, isn't he? And he gets one of these, and ooh, most Americans were smart enough at that point to figure out this is a scam. Look how long it's taken President Trump to finally come around to the truth. The whole thing is a scam. It never had any chance of success. It was an artificial construct hatched in Washington and London primarily, and to a lesser extent in Israel, to essentially harm Russia. What an utterly dumb and stupid idea. In the meantime, he neglects to point out we're at 38 trillion and counting. We're continuing to print. We can't really borrow very much anymore, Dan. Nobody wants to loan us much money. So we're just printing, quantitative easing over and over and over again, debasing the currency. So all of this has to be, all of these events and his comments on Zelensky, it all has to be viewed in that context.
And Doug, it's funny as you mentioned here, talk about our staff because Gary's all over stuff. Apparently, he can be over stuff even before you say it, because it turns out that he found a soundbite from the past earlier today from somebody else who also said the same thing you just did, that this is just the West looking for a way to harm Russia.
Я думаю, що у всіх різні інтереси. Причому у всіх у Заходу є ті, хто хоче, щоб ця війна йшла довго. Тому що це буде виснаження Росії, але ціною України, ціною життя людей. Це точно вигідно деяким країнам.
So that is, I had forgotten about that one, but there he is. Absolutely. He could have just literally been quoting you from almost 4 years ago now. 1 month into the war, he knew what the West was doing, and yet he has made himself a willing vassal. What can you say about that?
Well, he's worth over $1 billion. He has cash in multiple accounts across Europe and probably the Caribbean and places elsewhere in the world. So I guess he's come to terms with his betrayal of the Ukrainian people and nation. I've often said the man is not a Ukrainian, never was. He comes into this as a result of an oligarch, Kolomoisky, who is now in jail, and other influences in Washington, New York City, and Israel. And he had many opportunities to step up and say exactly that and point out that it was in Ukraine's interest to have peace. Now, people make excuses for Zelensky, Dan. They say, well, he's got these neo-Nazis there. Well, Kolomoisky, who put him into power effectively, has also funded all of these neo-Nazi organizations. By the way, Kolomoisky, like Zelensky, is Jewish. And these people are sporting Nazi symbols. They have funded these neo-Nazi organizations. I mean, they're clowns. Come on. Just because you put on a Nazi symbol from 80 years ago doesn't make you anything. But that sort of thing is what they love to sport, and it has been useful in terms of mobilizing Ukrainian hatred against Russia, because there are a lot of people there that still don't believe that Russia is any different from what it was 80 years ago. I mean, you can't make this stuff up. It doesn't make any sense, but it's real. What President Trump needs to do is end this. Stop the flow of money and arms of any kind. Get us out. Get all of the intelligence operatives and agents, get all the military personnel out of Ukraine. Halt this nonsense. Everybody's been involved in this, from Cavoli and Supreme Commander Europe all the way down into the lowest possible level with captains and sergeants and special operations. Just get them out. Put an end to this. It's been an enormous failure. But I don't think he's going to do it.
It's hard to say. But there was, in addition to the soundbite we just showed you from Trump that was released this morning that I guess he made yesterday, on Monday in Doha, Don Jr. went forth and was asked a very pointed question, which harkens back to what you said back in January.
And obviously, Ukraine has a massive corruption issue, and as you say,
it was a far more corrupt country than Russia, as delegated by the United States government prior to this war. But then, because of the war, and because he's one of the great marketers of all time, Zelensky became a borderline deity, especially to the left, where he could do no wrong. He was beyond reproach. Years of corruption, years of graft and theft on a world stage that everyone in this room knew was happening, was totally absolved. And it's ridiculous. We're not dealing in reality.
But is your hunch that President Trump is going to walk away?
I think he may. What's good about my father and what's unique about my father is you don't know what he's going to do. The fact that he's not predictable, he's not following the playbook of every clown who's, again, been a bureaucrat for decades, you don't know.
So now you could read that one of two ways, Doug. You could, because when she asked the question, will he walk away, uncharacteristically, he paused. So that means he didn't want to just give the answer he knew was right away. He said maybe, and then he goes into this, well, you don't know what he's going to do. So that could mean that the answer is yes, he's going to walk away, but I don't want to say it. But it could also mean no, he's not going to walk away, and I don't want to say that. How do you interpret it?
Well, we've contributed enormously to the corruption in Ukraine. Let's be frank. And as was pointed out earlier, the numbers of people inside the Washington Beltway, the financial interests that supported President Trump for re-election or for election, especially the major billionaire donors, all have stake or stakes in what's been going on in Ukraine. I think that has had an impact on President Trump and slowed his readiness or willingness to walk away. But let's go back to some realities. Having talked to President Trump on a couple of occasions, and this particular subject came up, and I'm talking about NATO and Germany and so forth. This is a man who has always understood from the beginning, we need to get out of Europe. We need to cut our losses in this whole campaign and get out. He understands that. He understands that our relationship with Russia, with Moscow, is far, far more important than anything happening in Kiev. He understands those things. But he's one of these people who can entertain two diametrically opposed opinions at the same time in his mind. This is not someone, contrary to popular belief, who's very decisive. Well, why would he be? He doesn't know anything about that region of the world. And the people that he surrounded himself with aren't going to help him because they're all there to ensure he stays. You know, why send Witkoff and Kushner to talk to President Putin? Why? They have no authority. They have no credentials. They're just friends of the president. You know, why not send Secretary of State Rubio? Well, I think we know why. Because Rubio is dedicated to the proposition that this must go on, that whatever harms Russia is good. This is a card-carrying neocon. Witkoff and Kushner may be friends, but they're just interested in making money. So there's no great stake in these other matters. But the Secretary of State, that's a different matter entirely. And look at the people that he wants around the president. They're bad news. These are people that will keep us embroiled and immersed in conflict and war with everybody on the planet for decades. So the president not only is entertaining two diametrically opposed opinions in his mind at the same time, he's surrounded for the most part, even in his inner circle, with people who are absolutely disastrous for the United States, disastrous for the cause of peace, disastrous for the survival of our country and its economy. I mean, I don't know how else to put it. I mean, listening to President Trump, and I like President Trump. I think he's a good human being, and I think he has good intentions. I don't think he's mean-spirited at all. And I think when he talks, he's being honest. But the problem is that's not enough. You have to move away from this confusion and put your money on what you really believe and think. And I think he's close to it. And I think that's what Don Jr. was trying to get to. But he's not there yet.
It doesn't appear he's yet. And unfortunately, fueling this idea that there is diametrically opposed ideas swirling around in the mind of the president, that apparently also extends to the United States ambassador to NATO, Ambassador Whitaker.
Don Jr.'s right. There may get to a point where if President Trump determines there's not a deal to be had, that he does step away from it. And that certainly, would be his nature. He does like having strategic ambiguity to be able to insert where he needs to insert. And he is expecting both sides to make progress. This war needs to end. He has been very clear about that. And the killing needs to stop. President Trump is the only one that can bring both sides to the table and work with them to mediate a resolution. There is no one else that can do it. If the United States walks away, if President Trump walks away, the likelihood of peace dramatically diminishes. And so, President Trump knows that, and obviously he's in a perfect position to resolve this, but it's going to take both sides. And if he determines that both sides are not serious about peace, he'll have to take that into his calculation. But ultimately, President Trump is the peacemaker in chief.
Okay, wait. Either you're the peacemaker in chief and you know how to bring these disparate parties together as a mediator, even though that we're a party to this, or then if it can't, we're going to walk away. But those things can't go together, yet they are trying to in his mind.
Well, Matt Whitaker is a good man, and he's becoming more politically astute. He's managed to be on every side of every issue all the time, which is a great achievement for any ambassador. Look, you're exactly right. this business of strategic ambiguity is nonsense. Strategic ambiguity gets you into wars. We need to be very unambiguous about what we want and what we don't want. We've had too many people in Washington for too many years who thought they could be cute and confuse the enemy. That's nonsense. We're confused. The opponent is not. Right now in Ukraine, we need to get out. That's the only answer. That's the decisive move that will spell the end of the Zelensky regime. And if people in Washington want to stand on their desks and say, "Oh, you're surrendering to Russia, you give it up, you're betraying Ukraine," the hell with them. They don't know what they're talking about. They're repeating talking points that have been written for them by the staff. The staff is responding to the donors. This is not about that. This is about the United States of America and its strategic interests. We have no strategic interest in this war in eastern Ukraine other than to promote peace and stability. The only way to promote peace and stability is to permanently stop any more support to this criminal, corrupt regime that Don Jr. accurately characterized. That's what needs to happen. That's what the president needs to do. Eventually, he'll do it. Sometimes I think President Trump embodies that most American of characters. Churchill said the Americans will always do the right thing after they've tried everything else. I think President Trump will do the right thing. I just wish he'd done this years ago. Certainly done it immediately after being inaugurated instead of waiting this long. Nothing has improved. Everything's gotten worse. It's a drag on us. It's a drag on him. He needs to cut his losses and get out.
You know, one last sound back from that interview that President Trump that gave to Politico that was released this morning, I thought was instructive. Not so much in where what he's thinking of to get out of it, but really in the challenge he has to actually act on this. And so, in light of Zelensky, I mean, let's go back to the February debacle in the Oval Office. All the things that Trump has tried to get done, and Zelensky keeps saying no. In light of all that, this is as strong as it is as of this morning.
Is Zelensky responsible for the stalled progress, or what's going on there?
Well, he's got to read the proposal. He hasn't read it
the most
yet.
recent draft.
That's as of yesterday. And maybe he's read it over the night. It would be nice if he would read it. You know, a lot of people are dying, so it would be really good if he'd read it. His people loved the proposal. They really liked it. His lieutenants, his top people, they liked it. But they said he hasn't read it yet. I think he should find time to read it.
I think he should find time to Doug, this is the president of the United States. This is the guy who is famously has this furious anger that he can blow up on people. Why is he playing with kid gloves with Zelensky instead of reading the riot act as you suggest?
Well, it goes back to how thoroughly does he understand the situation. And he says many of the right things, but when it comes to make the decision, he doesn't do it. He is much more of a political animal than I think the people who voted for him thought at the time. People wanted to believe that he was the tough-minded businessman who was making things happen and crushing his opponents. It's not true. I don't think it ever was true. As I've always said, if anything, he is too nice. He's actually a very nice human being. And I think that's one of his weaknesses. So, you know, at the end of the day, none of it matters. It's over. History will record that Joe Biden was the de facto destroyer of NATO. I don't think that'll be pinned on Trump, although the left and their friends will do everything in their power to do that. But I think it will be remembered that it was Joe Biden that committed not just the United States and its closest allies, but the entire NATO alliance to this nonsense. And he will go down in history as not only having destroyed NATO, but having destroyed the Ukrainian nation. I don't know that there's going to be much left. We're going to end up with a rump Ukraine. Odessa will fall into Russian hands, and then there'll be a recognition that what remains is really the historic Ukraine, which is this territory from Poland that reaches to the Dnieper and a little bit beyond, but all in a long strip in the northern part of what is today the Ukrainian state, at least on paper. It's very sad, but I think that's where we're headed. And I wish that President Trump would move with all possible speed to terminate this whole thing. But he's got too many people around him telling him not to do that.
Well, Doug, I think that he needs to get somebody else around real quick because as I see it, and I like your view on this, I think he is rapidly coming up to and maybe right on the precipice of a crucial decision point that will be forced on him one way or the other. If he does what you have suggested all along from a position of a declaration, I say this is what we're going to do. You can either get on board or fight it on your own. Then he's got full control of it. But if he keeps dithering like this and just letting events just kind of lag on, then we're going to get to the point to where I think, and we've talked about this before, militarily, the front could collapse at some point. And then all of a sudden the Russians, maybe even there's information, by the way, just recently that Russia has been massing a number of forces up in the Chernihiv area where they could potentially open a new front to put yet more pressure on the whole, now not 1,000-kilometer, but more like 1,500-kilometer front, which Ukraine just doesn't have the forces for. And if that happens, and now all of a sudden the thing starts collapsing, now Trump, if he now walks away, you think he would take criticism for, abandoning Ukraine now? He couldn't do it then. And then what's he going to do, Doug? Because it seems like he's going to come to the risk of doubling down on failure or then really being seen as a weaknesses. How do you see that danger?
Well, no one will ever see him as totally weak simply because he's president of the United States and we're an enormously powerful state. Even in our much diminished status right now, we're still seen as very powerful. So I don't think that's the case, but I think he will become politically irrelevant, which is unfortunate because we should have some say in how things go forward, if for no other reason to help the Europeans pick themselves up from this disaster and move elsewhere. But I don't think we will. I think these governments are going to fall. I've been saying that for months. They haven't yet, but I think they will. I'm talking about the governments in London, Paris, and Berlin. And I think you will see people much more like Orban come to power in these states, people who are first and foremost nationalists, but don't just pay lip service to peace, are genuinely interested in peace. They want peace and stability. They're not interested in Europe being mired in this halfway house between total war and peace, which is where it is right now. We could play a role in helping the Europeans extricate themselves, but I think it's probably too late. So I don't think it's going to happen.
Well, that's unfortunate literally for everyone involved, but we are where we are. I want to shift gears here to our own hemisphere here in the last bit of time we have with you. And that's specifically looking at a couple of things that are kind of related. First of all, on the potential for action in Venezuela. There is a meeting today of the Gang of Eight, which is some of the senior Republican Democrats in both the House and Senate, along with Secretary of State Rubio and Hegseth, that are meeting. And apparently some of the claims are anyway ahead of this meeting, because it's also including the General Dan Kane, that this could be a prelude to military action against Venezuela. How do you see
it? Stonewall Jackson, during the Civil War, held a council of war just before the Battle of Winchester. He listened to the recommendations. Ultimately, the first Battle of Winchester didn't go well. After that, he said, I will no longer hold any councils of war because they breed timidity and inaction. President Trump can listen to whatever these people have to say. He has to act in the interest of the American people in the United States. He has to act against the backdrop of a $38 trillion sovereign national debt, against the backdrop of a deteriorating financial system and economy. When we mention 38 trillion, we're not even talking about the private equity markets and the funds there that are desperate for cash and are being fed cash on a routine basis by Bessent to keep them alive. What he needs to do is call this thing off. I think we've already passed that point where you've got to say, look, these troops have all sat around long enough. These ships have floated around long enough. Either you go or you don't. And I think it's a very bad idea to go in there. And if you're concerned about the use of the Venezuelan banks to launder drug money, that's fine. There are ways to deal with that without invading the place. Drop the fiction that it's a big drug hub, though, and that they're shipping all these terrible drugs to us. Get back to business here in the United States. We've had some very positive developments recently that the press doesn't really talk about. You have this Traverse Port City up in Michigan, which had 3.8 tons of illegal drugs, overwhelming amounts of fentanyl from the Sinaloa cartel found in Michigan at the port city. They've arrested the director of the port. They've arrested local police. They've gone in there and cleaned house. That is exactly what needs to happen inside the United States. Then we have some chance of getting out of the mess that we're in with regard to illicit drugs, particularly fentanyl coming into the country. The problem is here at home. He needs to come to terms with that. He needs to reinforce that kind of activity that Homan and Noam and others are part of. That's where we need to focus. Don't waste our time, money, and resources on this intervention in Venezuela. It's just a losing proposition.
Now, one of the we didn't cut this part of the video, but from that same Politico interview with Trump that was released this morning, the interviewer pointedly asked him about Venezuela. Are you going to go in there? And he dismissed it and said, well, I'm certainly not going to tell you that. And then she says, well, but what about Maduro? Is there going to be a regime change? And he paused for a second and he just said, his days are numbered. And so, I mean, he wouldn't go into any further. She tried to press him a little bit further. So that was the extent of the exchange. That's all Trump would talk about. But that's the second time he's at least publicly said Maduro's days are numbered, implying that because of the phone calls I've made and all this combat power that's out there, that he's going to do something. Because here's the real problem. And I'd like you to assess the pros and cons of this from Trump's perspective. When he keeps saying things like this and he's got all this combat power out there, if he does as you recommend now, which is to call it off and go back, then he risks looking like a fool. And that Maduro, who has had all these weird, quirky dances and a bunch of other stuff and mocking Trump, can come out, looking good. And I worry that Trump may think, well, I'm not going to let him make a fool of me. So I would rather do something kinetic than just walk away. How do you think it's going to play out?
Well, you made all the right points. And it could be that his ego drives the decision-making process. That's always possible. Too much that goes on in Washington is mortgaged to ego. We're still in Europe and in Northeast Asia 80 years after the end of the Second World War. Why? Is it because we desperately need to be there for strategic reasons vital to the United States? No, absolutely not. Are we stopping the imminent outbreak of war between these various countries that could swallow the world? No, that's all nonsense. So I think what he needs to do is say, frankly, I would do what, I always talk about the fireside chats. There were only, I think, 6 or 7 of them. And I'm not an FDR supporter at all. But the fireside chats were effective, where he sat down and spoke on the radio in very, what's the right word, very quiet, unassuming terms, and said, I've considered the issue, and this is what I've decided to do, and this is why. I think he would be more successful than he thinks. And if somebody wants to press him on it, he said, well, I've thought about Maduro, and I think that Venezuela probably deserves better, but I'm not sure that forcibly removing him will produce the outcome that we would like to see. I mean, there are ways to phrase things. And if you say something like that, people are going to pay more attention to you because they're going to say, well, the man's given it some thought. He's changed his mind. So be it. Send the troops home. Forget it. Everybody, this new national security strategy, I'm sure you're going to want to talk about it. Right. It's not really a strategy. It's just a document with a lot of stuff packed into it. But having said that, one of the things that it wants to do is to focus us on the Western Hemisphere. I have no objections. I'm 100% for it. But focusing on the Western Hemisphere doesn't have to involve the invasion of a country the size of Venezuela. Establishing your credentials as a West Hemispheric power doesn't necessitate that. So I'm a little less worried about all that business than perhaps President Trump and his advisors. But I think he'd benefit from simply saying something along the lines that I mentioned. And, Maduro, how many Maduros are there out there? There are probably lots of Maduro types. You're not going to change the culture, the political thinking and behavior in that part of the world. So what makes you think the removal of one man is going to make any damn difference? I thought we learned these lessons the hard way in places like Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan, Panama,
Libya. Just
Yeah,
keep adding to the list.
I guess we haven't.
Apparently not. And I do want to go down that path a little bit with the national security strategy, because you and I spoke on the phone briefly last night, and I think we were kind of similar to that. And I wonder if you could kind of share with our audience here that there are a lot of good ideas. You just mentioned a couple of them and concepts that are useful in there, but it's not an actual strategy. And I wonder if you can explain, what is a strategy if it's not just this fancy document with a cool cover on the top? If that's not what this is, what would a strategy actually be?
Well, I've actually written a lot on that subject, as you know, and I think we can say certain things about what a strategy. Strategy outlines your strategic interests. It identifies those strategic interests which are most important or vital. Then it talks about the way in which we plan to defend, protect, and secure those interests. This isn't purely military. This is also commercial. I mean, President Trump has embarked on this dramatic tariff campaign, which I think leaves a lot to be desired. But he does understand that there is linkage between what is important economically, commercially, and militarily. So why don't we think about the following? Let's defend America first. That's certainly something which was hinted at in the document. Let's say number one, there are X number of pillars in this national security story. We're going to defend America first. We're going to reserve the use of our military power for the protection of the United States and its vital interests. Most of those are in the Western Hemisphere, but not all of them are. We are not going to commit our military power beyond the Western Hemisphere any longer. We're not going to try and export democracy at gunpoint, okay? How do we secure the country? Well, we have to secure our access to certain things. What are those? We have to have access to the high seas. Everybody does if they're going to trade commercially. Most of trade in the world, almost 90% of it is at sea. We have to protect the atmosphere. We need access to space. Everyone now wants access to space for the reasons that we don't need to go into detail, but it gives you opportunities for communication and trade that would otherwise not exist. Then we need to take some actions with our military establishment, because the thing has grown out of all proportion to our needs. I'm not talking about the numbers of soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines. We probably have too few of those. These are the people that actually deploy and fight and do something. I'm talking about this enormous overhead, the bloated numbers of generals and bureaucrats. They need to be purged. We need a new unified command plan that reduces the numbers of regional unified commands. We need to preserve our industrial base. We have to identify the specific industrial capacities we need. We have scientific lines of communication that we've got to protect, not just geographic ones. And we have to close down the overseas bases in other people's countries that serve no strategic purpose. And when we modernize our force, it's going to have to be a different force, certainly different from the one we have today, which has its roots in the Second World War and the Cold War. So we need high lethality, low density forces. We can't afford these enormous, expensive industrial age heavy metal formations and units and naval forces and so forth that we have, that Washington loves to buy. So those are the things that I would have looked for in a national security strategy, Dan. I didn't really see those. What I saw was we need to effectively let Europe decide Europe's future. Of course, we should have gotten out of there in the 1990s. Had we done it intelligently, it would have been a process of Europeanization that would stretch over 4 or 5 years. But that never happened. No one thought in those terms. We were trying to repurpose the NATO alliance to be used against people all over the world. That frankly was never in the interests of the European peoples. So these things all need to be addressed. And I don't disagree with what he's saying about NATO. I thought we should have been out of there many years ago. And the idea that the Europeans will instantly fight with each other, come on, that's just stupid. Europeans are, on the whole, as educated populations, better off than we are. The average European has a much better grasp of the world, I would say, than the average American. Our educational system has really failed us badly. And again, that's another critical aspect of our national strategy. What are you doing for education in the United States? How are you providing a path to employment? What are you preparing people for in the future? I would like to see all of those things wrapped in together, as opposed to bits and pieces that sound great. Oh yeah, well we got to let the Europeans run their own show. Good, that's great. Next, what else? This was almost a stream of consciousness document, but in the end, there was no framework for action.
Right, and that's really the one of the bigger issues. But I want to zero in on one of the things you mentioned there, because there was some information out just this morning that I think deserves to be examined, and that is on how we modernize our forces. Now, just kind of as a setup, in the 2000s, when I was still on active duty, I was assigned to the Future Combat Systems, which we've talked about a lot, and a lot of people understand was a complete disaster, et cetera. The concept was good. Let's modernize the force. We have this period of time to can get it done. If we had done it right, it'd been wonderful. But one of the big problems that we had, and I'll just zero in on this one, was with intelligence. We said, you know what, we're going to have perfect intelligence in the future, so we're designing this force around it, and we're going to have all of these technical capabilities, and we're going to have this interconnected force with communications means. It's going to basically be perfect. And even at the time, I was saying that's never going to happen. If you predicate it on perfection, you're setting us up for going on to battlefield where we're going to lose one day. Well, I wonder if something similar to that was not announced this morning by the Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth, when he made this announcement about what AI is going to do for our combat forces.
The future of American warfare is here, and it's spelled AI. As technologies advance, so do our adversaries. But here at the War Department, we are not sitting idly by. Under the leadership of President Trump, America will lead the charge on this technological transformation by revolutionizing the way we win. And that's why today we are unleashing GenAI.mil. This platform puts the world's most powerful frontier AI models, starting with Google Gemini, directly into the hands of every American warrior.
Now, of course, you've literally written many books on how to reform and reorganize and transformation under fire, et cetera, the whole force, the construct, the doctrine, and everything else. When I just hear, let's just take the AI and revolution how we win, I get a little nervous about that. What do you think?
There's an author, Arthur C. Clarke, and he wrote a short story called Superiority. And it was set in a galaxy far, far away. And there were two planetary systems that were at war with each other. One planetary system brought in some genius scientists and invested virtually everything they had in the super weapon. The other planet didn't have as many super geniuses. They looked at what they had, they improved it, they expanded it, they experimented, but they ultimately went to war with a diversity of capability, not all of which was equal to or even close to what their opponent had. Ultimately, the superweapon goes to war and fails. And the planet that took a more prudent approach ultimately spent less money, was more thoughtful, maximized what was on hand that was ready to go, ultimately wins the war. I think that Secretary Hegseth should read Arthur C. Clarke's Superiority. Now, why is he doing this? That's another issue. Everything in Washington is a money pit. Everybody in Washington wants to sign on for some program that will feed them, their constituents, their donors, money in perpetuity. So I'm sure that this new AI program will have thousands of lobbyists, people from various corporations, as well as members of the military, all there with their hands out to catch all the money that falls out of the bucket that is filled with cash. And they'll do whatever they can to maximize their profits. And what they produce is anybody's guess. How many billions of dollars did we squander on Future Combat System until finally Secretary Gates stepped in and killed it? And thank goodness he killed it. He also killed something called the Expeditionary Fighting Vehicle in the Marine Corps. That was an attempt to build the impossible vehicle that would be light and fast and amphibious, protect everybody in it, and could be launched at sea from 30, 40 miles out and creep onto the beach stealthily at night or whatever. It's complete farce. It had no chance of success. Most of the time, these things promise something that can't be delivered on. That's to break the laws of physics. Now, I don't know the details, but this is more AI hype. And right now, many people in the market who are very familiar with artificial intelligence are concluding that this bubble is about to burst. Some people think it's already started. In other words, your expectations of what the technology will produce and the real outcome are not the same. And so it takes time, and you need to experiment, and you need to move slowly. And right now is not the time to blow your savings on one thing. The other thing is that, in contrast to the past, you have a lot of private sector artificial intelligence work that's being done. In the past, we used to have to fund all the R&D through the Department of Defense. We don't have to do that now. So let's see what the market will bear. Let's see what the market produces. Let's not hitch our hopes and aspirations entirely to ephemeral dreams that may turn out to be utterly groundless.
And one of the things that gives me concern about making the right calls on those, I'm going to show you a really granular level of a decision making that's coming out of the Pentagon right now. So again, in context, 4 years of war between Russia and Ukraine, and really going back to 2020 with the Azerbaijan-Armenia war, where drones really took the first center stage, and how they changed how maneuver warfare was done on the ground, and all the things that have happened since. In light of that, I am concerned about this article that came out in the Military Times on Monday. It says this is what the Secretary of Defense is focused on, is 300,000 drones, a buildup that means we know what we still need to do. But then you look at the details, which you mentioned a second ago, is approximately 30,000 of these drones will be delivered by July 26, followed by a ramp up to over 200,000 units by 2027. Now, Doug, there's a couple of other headlines we could show here from some of the other, from both the Ukraine and the Russian side. Russia is producing about 2 million per year right now, and Ukraine is somewhere around the same, but about 100,000 per month. And we're saying that the United States of America, with all of our capabilities and everything else, in a year and a half from now, will be up to about in a year where they are for a couple of months. What does that tell you about where we're focused, and do we really understand the nature of modern warfare?
Well, Russia's at war, and as a result, they are going to double down on whatever works. They're going to reinforce success. So whatever they're producing is field tested. They're confident. They know it'll do a good job. We're not at war, and we haven't necessarily field tested everything. And instead of putting all of your eggs in one or two particular baskets, it might make sense right now to field what works in smaller numbers before investing very, very heavily. Now, that's been done before. If you go back to the interwar period, both the Soviets and the Germans in the 20s and the 30s engaged in a lot of experimentation. Some of that was joint until 1932. And the Soviets benefited enormously from it, but I would argue so did the Germans. The outcome were two forces that were not perfect, but they were light years ahead of anything in the West. But it went through a long process of experimentation, try and fail, pick what works, drop, discard what doesn't, and continuously evolve. That's where we need to be. I'd feel much more comfortable if we did some of this with real soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines. You know, I did some work for the Secretary of the Navy, or the Office of Secretary of the Navy, years ago. One of the things that we were told, my partners and I, was that the sailors in the Navy will say, what we really need on board this ship are shotguns. And you go out there, you get the explanation why they need the shotguns. It makes perfect sense. You go back and say, they need shotguns. 5 years later, they get laser pistols that don't work. In other words, the real requirement that was valid is lost in the process, and you get something that the contractor decides is great, that people at high levels are enamored with but don't really understand, and the money and the time and the opportunity are all wasted. So again, you know, we're going to go into a period where you're not going to see $1 trillion plus budgets for defense. That's just not going to happen. Nobody wants to admit that. Nobody wants to admit that we're going to have to cut spending. Our creditors are beginning to walk away from us. if you don't demonstrate any willingness to exercise financial discipline, eventually your creditors don't supply you with anything. We're getting closer to that. So I hope we don't have catastrophic failure.
Yeah.
It doesn't look good right now. So I think these kinds of statements are probably ill-advised, and we should reel in some of our expectations and take a leaf out of the Soviet and the German playbooks of the 1920s and 30s and do some serious experimentation.
Yeah,
But
we don't want to come out on the wrong side of that calculation, just as France and the UK in May 1930, but May 1940. Sorry, but I'm afraid we're gonna have to leave it right there. We actually have another show to do almost right away. So thanks for coming on today, Doug. We really appreciate it. Be sure and like and subscribe if you haven't, and we'll see you in just a few minutes on the next episode of the Daniel Davis Deep Dive.